I found a hidden cemetery at my new job, but my boss says it doesn't exist. The job was supposed to be a lifeline. I think it's an anchor. My buddy Ren called me about it when I was about 2 weeks from getting evicted. Said some woman was paying cash under the table to strip an old carnival for parts. Decent money, no questions asked. All I had to do was show up and tell the difference between scrap metal and something worth fixing. The owner is a woman named Adeline. She's one of those sun-baked southern ladies who looks like she was carved from an old piece of driftwood. Skin like tanned leather, hair the color of straw and ash, and a voice like gravel tumbling in a coffee can. Calls everybody darlin', but her eyes are sharp, missing nothing. She chain smokes these unfiltered cigarettes, cupping the flame in her hand out of pure habit, even in the dead still air of her trailer office. She told us she inherited the whole damn mess from her father. He had more dreams than sense, that man, she said, blowing a plume of smoke toward the ceiling fan. Just pick it clean. I want his ghost off my property. The carnival is about 40 minutes out of town, down a road that turns from cracked asphalt to dirt and then just gives up. It's strangled by woods, massive, ancient live oaks dripping with Spanish moss so thick it looks like the trees are weeping. The forest walls, everything in, eats the sound. It makes you feel like you're the last person on earth. The place itself is a corpse. 10 acres of rust and rot. The main midway is a spine of broken concrete with weeds pushing through like green bone fragments. A huge Ferris wheel stands against the sky, listing to one side, its cars hanging open like mouths in a silent scream. Everything that was once canvas is just shredded ribbons flapping in the breeze. The whole lot smells of rot and rust and something sickly sweet, like cotton candy left out in the rain for 30 years. Adeline split us up. Ren got the bumper cars, which were basically a swamp full of rusted tubs. I got the carousel. It sits right in the middle of it all, a monument to decay. The painted horses are frozen in a dead gallop, their colors bleached to bone white by the sun. Some have snapped off their poles and lie in the tall grass, their glass eyes staring up at the empty sky. You can see the guts of the machine, a greasy tangle of chains and gears, exposed to the elements. But you can tell it was beautiful once. Someone loved this place into existence. Someone bled for it. And for the first week, that's all it was. A hot, dirty, quiet job. Then, yesterday afternoon, everything changed. Ren had driven into town for parts and beer. I was alone, wrestling with the carousel's main control panel. The box was a rat's nest of brittle wires and actual, literal rat shit. The stink of ozone and rodent piss was thick enough to gag on. The heat was unreal, the kind of wet, heavy heat that doesn't just sit on you, it wears you like a shroud. The cicadas were screaming from the trees, a constant, high-pitched thrum that gets inside your skull. I was about to pack it in for a break when I heard it. Music. Faint at first. A tinny, plinking melody. Like an old wind-up toy. It was a familiar tune, a lullaby my grandmother used to hum, but it was wrong. The notes were slightly off-key, dragging and speeding up in ways that made my teeth ache. I thought maybe Ren had come back early and was messing with me. Or maybe one of the other guys on the crew had managed to get some ancient sound system working. I dropped my pliers, wiped the sweat from my eyes with the back of a greasy hand, and listened. It wasn't coming from the midway. It was coming from the trees. From deep inside the woods that bordered the property. I should have ignored it. I know that. I should have gotten back to stripping copper wire and minded my own fucking business. But the heat was getting to me, and that broken little melody was pulling. That's the only way to describe it. It was like a string tied to the base of my skull, gently tugging me forward. I walked past a collapsed skee-ball alley and pushed through a curtain of overgrown kudzu. That's where I found the trail. It was barely there, just a whisper of a path snaking into the dark of the forest. It looked like nothing had walked it in 100 years. The moment I stepped under the canopy of the trees, the temperature dropped 10 degrees. The screaming of the cicadas stopped. Dead silence, except for that music box lullaby, which was clearer now, closer. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. Sunlight struggled to get through the leaves, painting the forest floor in a weird, greenish gloom. The path twisted around a huge oak tree whose roots clawed at the dirt like arthritic fingers, and then it opened into a clearing. My breath just stopped. It was a small private graveyard. Not a real cemetery, more like a family plot. A dozen headstones leaning at all angles, being swallowed by moss and ivy. They were so old the inscriptions were almost completely gone, worn smooth by a century of rain. The few names I could make out were old-timey, carved in a fancy, spidery script. Sinclair. Evers. Dates from the 1850s. This place was older than the carnival, older than Adeline's daddy and his bad decisions. This was something else entirely. But that wasn't what made the hairs on my arms stand up. In the center of the clearing, sitting on the flat top of the largest, most ornate headstone, was a music box. The music box. Everything else in this godforsaken place was rotting back into the dirt, but this thing was perfect. It was made of a creamy, polished bone, not porcelain, with delicate brass fittings that gleamed in the dim light. Tiny, hand-painted bluebells were scattered across its surface. The lid was glass, and inside, little carousel horses spun slowly. They weren't like the ones on the midway. These were carved from dark wood, with manes of real horsehair and tiny, glittering eyes made of something that looked like obsidian. They spun and spun to that broken lullaby. I stared at it for a long time. The sight was so wrong, this perfect, beautiful thing in the middle of all this death and decay. It felt like a trap. But I picked it up anyway. It was heavy and cold to the touch, despite the suffocating humidity. The instant my fingers closed around it, the music cut off. Silence rushed back in, so total it felt like I'd gone deaf. I had to show Adeline. Maybe it was some weird memorial. Maybe she'd know whose it was. I found her in the trailer, poring over invoices. "Hey, Ms. Adeline," I said, holding it out. "Found this back in the woods. I think somebody must have left it." The change that came over her was terrifying. All the color drained from her face, leaving her skin the color of old parchment. She stared at the box in my hands like I'd just brought a live snake into her office. "Where?" she said, her voice a dry rasp. "Where exactly did you find that?" "In a little graveyard back there," I said, starting to feel a cold knot in my stomach. It was just sitting on the biggest stone. Weird, right? Things in perfect condition. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the cheap linoleum floor. Her hands were trembling. I saw her lips move, whispering something that sounded like a prayer. "Odessa, honey." "You listen to me," she said, her voice low and shaky. "There is no graveyard in those woods." "What?" "That's crazy. I was just there. Look at this thing. It's not even. Give it to me." It wasn't a request. Her voice went flat and hard, colder than any winter I've ever known. She lunged forward and snatched the box from my hands. The second her skin touched the polished bone, her whole body seized. A low, guttural noise escaped her throat. Her knuckles went white. "Oh, Lord God," she whispered, her eyes wide with a kind of horror I'd never seen on a human face. "He said this day would never come." She stumbled backward, still clutching the box, and fumbled in a drawer, pulling out an old, grease-stained dish towel. She wrapped the music box in it like she was handling radioactive waste. Then she grabbed a dusty bottle of what looked like water and a small container of salt from a cabinet. "Here." She shoved the salt and water at me. "Wash your hands with this. Now. And don't you ever go back there. You hear me?" I was too stunned to argue. I just stood there as she frantically mixed the salt and water in a coffee mug. "What's going on, Adeline? What is that thing?" She grabbed my arm, her grip like a vice. She looked me dead in the eye, and her face was a mask of pure primal fear. "That place you found," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That's not a graveyard, it's a lid. You just went and peeked underneath."